Dorian Ashcroft handed his wife the divorce envelope inside the dining room of the Ashcroft family estate. Not through an attorney, not in private, but at the long mahogany table where his mother sat at the head like a woman, presiding over a verdict she had already written, and where the woman he had been meeting in private sat beside him in the chair that had always been Ravenna's. Ravenna Cole Ashcroft, 36-year-old wife of Dorian and the only licensed structural engineer in a family that had built its reputation on construction, stood near the doorway with her coat still on because no one had offered her a seat. Dorian, 40, president of Ashcroft & Sons Construction and the third-generation heir of a company now drowning in deferred contracts and overextended credit, held the envelope the way a man holds something he knows is wrong but has already decided to do. Millicent Ashcroft, 65, Dorian's mother and the woman who treated the Ashcroft name like a crown she wore to bed, watched without blinking from the head of the table. Verena Croft, 30, well-connected niece of Stanford Croft, the investor Millicent had spent 4 months pursuing, smiled like she was already measuring the drapes. Dorian said, "I've asked you here because I need to be honest." Ravenna looked at the envelope in his hand. She already knew. 3 nights ago she had stood in the upstairs hallway and heard his voice through a half-closed door, low and careful. She won't make a scene. She doesn't have the leverage. She had not knocked. She had gone downstairs, made coffee and called Felix Nance 50, her attorney and the only man outside the Cole family trust who understood exactly who Ravenna actually was. Now she stood in the doorway and let Dorian finish. "This marriage isn't working," he said. "I think we both know that." Millicent straightened. "Ravenna, you're a sensible woman. Dorian needs a partner who can move with the company's future. Verena's family brings capital, connections, real weight." A pause that was not a pause. It was a shrug dressed as consideration. "You bring good intentions." Verena tilted her head. "No hard feelings. Some chapters end so bigger ones can begin." Ravenna looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Dorian. "Did you decide this?" she asked. "Or did she?" Dorian looked away. That was all she needed. She took the envelope from his hand because Dorian did not yet understand who he was handing it to. He did not know that Ravenna Cole, her name before she ever added Ashcroft to it, was the sole controlling beneficiary of the Cole family trust established by her father Bertram Cole before Ravenna turned 22. He did not know the Cole family trust held controlling interest in Brightwell Development Group, one of the largest private real estate development firms in the region. He did not know Brightwell had been in confidential talks for 5 months to award the Meridian Ridge construction contract, the kind of contract that would have cleared Ashcroft & Sons' debt twice over, and that the final terms were sitting in a folder on Ravenna's desk at home. He thought handing her that envelope made him free. It only removed the last person in his life who had been protecting him. If you believe loyalty should never be mistaken for weakness, stay with this story until the end. Because the woman they pushed out of that dining room is the same woman holding the paper that decides what happens to the company, the mistress, and the name his mother worshipped. Comment justice if you know that quiet does not mean powerless. And subscribe to Broken Promise Tales for more stories where the truth arrives exactly when it should. Bertram Cole had taken Ravenna to her first job site when she was 9 years old. She remembered standing on a dirt lot in a hard hat, 3 sizes too large, while men poured a foundation. Her father had crouched beside her and pointed not at the machinery, but at the workers moving through the mud. "A building is only as honest as the people who put it together," he had said. "Never forget who's actually holding the weight." She had held on to that for 27 years. She had become a structural engineer because of it. She had married a man who owned a construction company because she believed, at least in the beginning, that Dorian understood it the same way. They had met at an industry conference. Dorian had been funny, genuinely nervous beneath the polish, and he had listened when she talked about load distribution and material fatigue without his eyes going flat. On their second date, he took her to see a low-rise warehouse his grandfather had built in 1961, the brick still even and true after 4 decades, and told her he wanted to make something that outlasted him. She had believed him. That was before she understood that Millicent had been choosing Dorian's professional contacts since he was 25. That was before the board dinners where she was seated near the wall. Before Dorian started finishing her sentences in client meetings with "what my wife means to say," which was never what she meant to say. For the last year, Ravenna had watched Ashcroft & Sons from 2 sides. As Dorian's wife, she saw what he tried to hide, the stress that lived in his shoulders after 10 at night, the stack of vendor notices he turned face down when she walked in, the way he laughed too loudly at Stanford Croft's jokes at dinner. As Brightwell's controlling owner, she received confidential reports from her project director every Thursday morning. Brightwell's board had identified Ashcroft & Sons as a viable partner for the Meridian Ridge contract, a multi-phase commercial development large enough to clear Ashcroft's debt twice and set the company stable for the better part of a decade. But because Ravenna was married to Dorian, her trust attorneys had insisted on a clean process, no private communications, no marital influence, independent review at every stage. The beneficial owner of Brightwell would be disclosed formally through legal channels before any contract was signed. So when Ravenna stood on the Ashcroft job site in her plain coat and steel-toed boots, the same ones she had worn since graduate school, she asked questions like a concerned wife rather than an owner with full access to the due diligence file. Obai Crane, 61, the operations manager at Ashcroft & Sons, and the kind of man who had held the company together through 3 recessions and 2 rounds of family mismanagement, met her near the site trailer one morning with grease on his sleeve and something tired sitting behind his eyes. "The East Crane's been running on a temporary fix for 6 weeks, he said. "If we get the Morrison extension, it won't make it through the concrete pour." Ravenna already knew. She had read it in the equipment assessment. Brightwell's engineers had submitted as part of their due diligence. "How many people on that crew?" she asked. 14. He looked at the ground, and Morrison hasn't confirmed the extension yet. June Bassett, 59, the crew dispatcher who had worked for Ashcroft & Sons longer than some of the equipment in the yard, stopped when she passed them with a clipboard. "My granddaughter got into state," June said. "Engineering program." Ravenna's expression softened. "She'll be good at it." June nodded and walked on. She did not know about the quiet letter Ravenna had sent through a Brightwell supplier contact 3 weeks earlier. She did not know about the scholarship review Ravenna had flagged through a colleague. That was how Ravenna helped, without making kindness into a performance. Inside Dorian's office, the sounds were already familiar. "I need you to hold the credit line," he said into the phone. A pause. "That is not a number I can work with." He hung up and flipped a folder closed when he heard Ravenna enter. Under the folder she could already see the corner of a financing proposal. She recognized the Croft Capital letterhead before he covered it. "How bad is the cash position?" she asked. Dorian forced a smile. "Every company goes through cycles. If you're looking at outside financing, you should let Marion review the covenants before anyone signs anything." Marion Delacroix was Ashcroft & Sons' outside corporate attorney, and she had already told the board in writing or emergency financing with aggressive control clauses could poison any pending acquisition process. Dorian looked at her with the expression he reserved. For moments he felt she was overstepping. "Ravenna, I've been running this company for 10 years. "I know." "Then trust that I know what I'm doing." She let it go. Not because she agreed, because she had learned which conversations Dorian was capable of having and which ones he would only understand later, when there was no longer time to do anything about what he had missed. The Croft Capital meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in the Ashcroft estate dining room, which Millicent had chosen because she liked to conduct business in rooms that reminded guests who owned the furniture. Stanford Croft, 58, founder of Croft Capital Group, presented himself with the manner of a man who had spent years being mistaken for a rescuer. He placed a leather portfolio in front of Dorian with the quiet confidence of someone presenting a gift. Verena sat beside Dorian, not across from him, beside him. The terms were not a gift. Ravenna read them from her seat near the wall. The chair Millicent had positioned slightly apart from the main table, as if she were an observer rather than a wife. The interest rate was structured to compound faster than any reasonable growth projection for a mid-size construction firm. The security package gave Croft Capital approval rights over contract assignments, equipment transfers, and any change of control event if a single payment was missed. 1 payment, not 3. 1 missed payment gave them the authority to redirect incoming contract revenue before Ashcroft & Sons ever saw it. It was not rescue financing, it was a leash with a very short chain. "This covers your immediate gap," Stanford said pleasantly. "It buys you time to pursue larger contracts without vendor pressure as a distraction." Dorian looked at the proposal the way a drowning man looks at an extended hand, without asking what the hand expects in return. "It could work," he said. "It gives them a prior claim on your receivables," Ravenna said. The room went quiet. Stanford's expression held its warmth, but something behind his eyes cooled by a measurable degree. "That's standard lender protection." Its lender control described as protection. One shortfall, one, and they can redirect incoming contract payments before your payroll is covered. Dorian's jaw tightened. Ravenna. Millicent spoke before he could. Stanford has restructured 4 companies this year alone. I'd like to know which 4. Stanford laughed. His eyes did not. Verena leaned forward and pointed to a clause midway down the page. Her hand rested near Dorian's. It stayed there a beat longer than necessary. Ravenna noticed. Dorian noticed. Dorian did not move his hand. The real opportunity, Verena said, voice smooth, is positioning Ashcroft as a preferred builder for Croft-affiliated developments. The financing is just the door. What developments? Ravenna asked. Verena smiled. That's a conversation for people with a seat at the table. The line was delivered gently, like a knife presented handle first. Millicent looked satisfied. Dorian said nothing. After the meeting, Ravenna stood near the front entrance and watched Dorian walk Verena to her car. She watched him laugh at something Verena said. A real laugh, not the polite one he used in client meetings. It was the first real laugh she had heard from him in weeks. That was harder than the financing terms. That evening she called Felix. Begin a full investigation into Croft Capital, she said. I want everything. Felix paused. Business misconduct or something more personal? Ravenna looked out the window at the company her husband was handing to strangers. Start with the business, she said. See where it leads. She heard it 3 nights later. The house was dark past 10. She had been in the study reviewing the Brightwell acquisition timeline when Dorian's voice came through the half-open bedroom door, low and even, the way a person speaks when they know someone else is in the house. She won't understand the structure even if she reads it, he said. A pause, then, Mother's right. I've been putting this off too long. Ravenna sat very still. She did not go to the door. She did not knock. She picked up her phone and sent Felix one message. Move the Brightwell timeline forward. She had not been invited to the family gathering at the estate. 5 days later, she found out about it the way she had found out about most things for years. By reading the details, Dorian assumed she was too distracted to notice the dry cleaning pickup for his good suit. A text from Millicent he placed face down on the kitchen counter. Flowers delivered to the estate that morning that were clearly not meant for a dinner table. She drove there anyway. When she arrived, the lights in the front sitting room were on. She came in through the side entrance. Dorian stood near the fireplace. Verena was close to him, her hand at his collar, adjusting something that did not need adjusting. Millicent stood to the side watching with the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for a plan to arrive at this exact moment. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. Then Verena smiled. She did not step away. She let Ravenna see everything clearly and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Millicent spoke first. Well, she said with the calm of a judge whose verdict was already written, this saves us a longer conversation. From the hallway, Pearl Odom, 57, the estate housekeeper who had worked for the Ashcroft family since Dorian was in high school, appeared in the doorway holding a dish towel with a look on her face that said she had witnessed too much in that house and had made peace with none of it. Ravenna looked at Dorian. Was any part of this a marriage to you, or was it always just an arrangement you hadn't finished outgrowing? His face reddened. That is not fair. Answer the question. He looked at Verena instead of at his wife. That was his answer. Millicent picked up a sealed folder from the side table and placed it on the mantel as though she were completing a transaction she had been looking forward to. Ravenna could see her own name printed on the tab before Millicent opened it. Divorce papers, already drafted, already notarized. Callum prepared these last week, Millicent said. Dorian wants this handled cleanly. Verena placed her bracelet on the mantel beside the folder, a gesture so deliberate it was almost honest in its theatrics. Leave with your dignity. Dorian has made his choice. Ravenna picked up the folder. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not plead for a place in a room where they had already removed her chair. She turned and walked out. In the car alone, her voice shook once. He served me divorce papers in front of her, she told Felix. Felix was quiet. Then, do you want to delay the Brightwell process? Ravenna looked at the lit windows of the estate. No, she said. Move forward, exactly as planned. Felix Nance's office at 6 in the morning was a room where serious things had been decided for 30 years. He placed 3 folders in front of Ravenna while the coffee was still hot. Divorce protection, Brightwell acquisition, Croft Capital investigation. Clement Hatch, 43, The private investigator Felix used for corporate cases had been working through the night. His face when he walked in told Ravenna the news was bad before he opened his mouth. Croft Capital has run this exact structure 6 times, Clement said. Company in distress. Outside investor offers fast liquidity. A personal relationship appears between the investor's representative and the ownership family. Assets get pledged. The company misses a payment, sometimes because Croft engineers conditions that make the shortfall inevitable, and they assume control. Then they strip the productive assets and leave. Ravenna turned the pages slowly. 6 companies, hundreds of workers displaced. She thought of Obi with worry behind his eyes. She thought of June's face when she mentioned her granddaughter getting into state. The premarital trust structure, she said. Walk me through it again. Felix did not consult his notes. He had already run this a dozen times. The Cole family trust was established before your marriage by 14 years. Brightwell's ownership flows entirely through it. The separation agreement Dorian has prepared confirms that trust-held assets remain separate. Once he signs, he has no standing to challenge Brightwell's acquisition authority. He signed the premarital agreement without reading it carefully. He signed it because Millicent told him your father's trust was probably sentimental, not financial. That particular truth stung. Not because Millicent had been wrong about her father, she had been wrong about almost everything, but because Dorian had chosen to believe her without asking. A memory rose in Ravenna without warning. She was young, standing in her father's office after a deal had gone badly wrong. She had wanted him to punish the men who had lied to him. Bertram Cole had looked at her, said revenge is wanting someone to hurt. Consequence is stopping them from hurting someone else. Now she understood what he meant. I don't want chaos, she said. I want records, I want proof. I want every legal line clean enough to hold up in any room. Clement nodded. Then we build the case before we build the stage. Ravenna went back to the estate one evening for 3 things. Her father's framed project survey. The first real development he had ever completed. His handwriting in the corner B. Cole, 1987, a grey wool coat she had owned since graduate school, and a small clock radio Dorian had given her in their first apartment because she had told him she hated waking up in silence. Pearl opened the door before she could knock. Mrs. Ashcroft, she said softly. Just Ravenna, Ravenna said. Pearl held the door and said nothing else, but the look on her face carried everything she had kept quiet across all those years. In the kitchen, Ravenna remembered Dorian burning eggs on their first anniversary because he had insisted on making breakfast himself. In the hallway, she remembered Millicent remarking that the paint color she had chosen for the guest room was working class. At the time she had laughed, thinking it was a joke. Later she understood it wasn't. In the study, she opened the bottom drawer, looking for the survey frame. She found the notes instead. Dozens of them. Small folded papers she had slipped into jacket pockets and briefcases and taped to thermoses for 4 years of marriage. Notes that said things like you've got this and home by 7 and the Morrison bid is going to go your way. I can feel it. He had saved every single one. She sat down slowly. That was the part she had not prepared for. She had expected indifference, and indifference she knew how to carry. But this small private archive of everything she had tried to give him sat in her chest differently. He had been here all along, keeping proof of her love in a drawer while letting his mother make her feel like a footnote in her own house. Saving the notes was not the same as honoring the woman who wrote them. She took the survey frame. She left the clock radio. That particular quiet was no longer hers. She was carrying the frame to her car when headlights swept the driveway. 3 car doors. Dorian, Millicent, and Verena walked toward the entrance, and for a moment no one saw Ravenna standing beside her car in the dark. Then Millicent did. Verena looked at the frame under Ravenna's arm. You still have a key? Ravenna set the key on the porch railing. Not after tonight. Dorian stared at her. Ravenna. I came for what was mine before I forgot myself in this house. Millicent laughed. Short, dismissive. Still speaking in riddles. That's what women do when they've run out of arguments. Ravenna looked at her. For a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, you taught your son to look down so often he never noticed what was above him. Something shifted in Dorian's face. Not understanding, something earlier than understanding. The first edge of a feeling he would not be able to name until the next morning in a conference room with every person in his professional life watching him try. Ravenna got in her car. Her phone rang before she reached the end of the block. Brightwell's board packets have been delivered to all independent directors and the Ashcroft & Sons board, Felix said. The conflict review summary is included. The ownership disclosure is on page 1 of every folder. Dorian's copy. Opens under seal. The chairman breaks it when the meeting is called to order. Ravenna did not look in the rearview mirror. Good, she said. Let them read it in front of each other. Dorian Ashcroft was mid-sentence when the conference room doors opened. He had prepared remarks, a slide showing Croft Capital's projected financing schedule, a framed quote from his grandfather mounted near the projector, which had been Millicent's idea. Then Ravenna walked in. The room held 14 people. Augustine Price, 70, the independent chairman of Brightwell's Contract Review Committee, sat at the center. Marion Delacroix, 53, Ashcroft & Sons' own corporate attorney, sat 2 seats down, and her expression told Dorian she had expected this meeting to arrive differently. Stanford Croft sat near the wall with his leather portfolio already open. Verena sat beside Dorian in a cream blazer, her hand resting on the arm of his chair. Obi sat at the far end in his best jacket, stiff with discomfort but present, because the independent committee had requested an operations witness. Millicent had positioned the photographer near the back wall. When Ravenna entered, the photographer lowered the camera and did not raise it again. Felix came in behind her. Clement came in behind Felix, carrying a sealed document case. Dorian's voice stopped mid-sentence. "What is she doing here?" he said. Augustine Price stood. His voice carried the authority of a man who had been in too many rooms with people who confused confidence for competence. "Ravenna Cole Ashcroft is present by right," he said. "As controlling beneficiary of the Cole Family Trust, she is the principal owner of Brightwell Development Group and the authorized representative for today's Meridian Ridge Contract Award." The room went still. Millicent's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. Verena's expression did not fade gradually, it stopped. Stanford Croft's hand paused over the leather portfolio and did not move again. Dorian stared at his wife, and the memories arrived without warning. Ravenna asking to review the Morrison contract. Ravenna warning him about Croft's payment covenants. Ravenna asking him to let Marion look at the financing terms. Ravenna standing in his office saying, "I heard fear," while he looked at her like someone who had wandered into the wrong meeting. "It's business, Ravenna. You wouldn't understand." Every moment looked different now. Verena leaned toward Stanford. Stanford did not respond. His eyes were on the folders. Felix placed documents on the table and spoke in a clear, measured voice. Brightwell Development Group entered the Meridian Ridge procurement process 7 months ago. The Cole Family Trust predates the Ashcroft marriage by 14 years. The separation agreement signed 72 hours ago confirms that all trust-held assets remain separate from marital property. Dorian Ashcroft has no claim over Brightwell's decisions. By the terms of the agreement, he signed himself. Dorian found his voice. "You never told me." Ravenna looked at him from across the table. "You told me I wouldn't understand." Clement opened the sealed case and passed copies to Augustine, to Marion, to the 2 auditors seated near the wall. Felix continued. Croft Capital Group approached Ashcroft & Sons while simultaneously pursuing access to Brightwell's vendor network through Verena Croft's personal relationship with Dorian. Internal communications obtained through Brightwell's legal review confirm that Stanford Croft received confidential Ashcroft & Sons financial information from Millicent Ashcroft before any formal financing agreement was signed. That information was not authorized for external disclosure. Millicent rose from her chair. "I was protecting my son." Ravenna turned to her. "You handed strangers the weak points of a company 300 workers depend on." Millicent opened her mouth and then did not. For the first time in 4 years, the woman who had called Ravenna's work good intentions, and her paint choices working class, and her silence weakness, had run out of places to stand. Felix continued through the evidence. The prior company's Croft Capital had hollowed out. The manufactured payment shortfalls, the coordinated approach that always featured a personal relationship used to accelerate asset access, the preliminary agreement Dorian had signed without disclosing the conflict to his own board. Stanford closed his portfolio. "Croft Capital will withdraw from." Marion's voice was quiet and final. "Croft Capital's proposal is rejected. All further communications will go through legal counsel. Any interference with the contract process from this point forward will be documented and preserved." Stanford sat back down. There was nothing left to perform. Augustine spoke next. "The independent committee recommends Brightwell proceed with the Meridian Ridge Award to Ashcroft & Sons, subject to the governance modifications in your packets." Dorian looked up fast. "What modifications?" Ravenna opened the final section. Effective immediately, Dorian Ashcroft is suspended from executive authority pending full conflict of interest review. Millicent Ashcroft is removed from all informal advisory roles and barred from internal company access pending investigation. Stanford Croft's proposal is voided. Verena Croft's involvement will be entered into the corporate record. She paused. O.B. Crane will oversee daily operations through the first contract phase, reporting to the transition committee. No workers will be reduced during the initial period. O.B. pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the grain of the wood. When he looked up, his eyes were bright, and he did not trust himself to speak. At the back of the room, June Bassett had been permitted in as a crew witness. When she understood that the crew would be kept whole, she covered her mouth with both hands. She did not make a sound. She simply closed her eyes, like a person who had been holding their breath since February and had finally been told it was safe to breathe. Dorian stood slowly in the way a person stands when they are not yet sure how much they have lost. "Ravenna," he said. "Wait." She gathered her folders. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. She stopped. She looked at him across the table and let him see her face clearly, not the mask she had worn through every boardroom and every dining room where she had been seated near a wall, just her face. "I made a mistake," he said. She thought about the notes in the drawer. She thought about the man who had stood outside his father's funeral in the rain and held her hand and cried, and promised her that love would mean something, that he would never become the kind of man who chose a name over a person. She had stayed through late nights and unpaid bills, and Millicent's cold assessments, and Dorian's pride, because she had believed him. He had not been pulled away. He had walked. "A mistake," she said, "is miscalculating a load-bearing figure. What you built was a life where everyone in it had a voice except your wife." She reached into her coat pocket and set her wedding ring on the table between them. Dorian looked at it. "I love the man who gave me this," she said. "I don't know the man who made me prove my worth in front of witnesses." He did not pick the ring up. Neither did she. At the far end of the room, Verena rose. Her voice was quiet, but not quiet enough for the room. "You told me she was nothing." Dorian turned. "There is no contract without Brightwell," Verena said, her voice stripped of the warmth she had been performing for months. "And there is no Brightwell without her." She looked at Dorian the way a person looks at a door that no longer leads anywhere. "There is no we if there's nothing left to align with." She walked out. Stanford followed without looking at Dorian or at Millicent or at anyone. The moment the strategy collapsed, loyalty became an expense he was not willing to carry. Millicent sat alone at the table in her dress chosen for a celebration, her pearls turning slowly between her fingers. Board members filed past without meeting her eyes. The photographer had packed up his equipment and slipped out through the side door. The framed grandfather quote stood on its easel near the projector, and no one looked at it. The woman who had treated the Ashcroft name like a crown was finally sitting inside what the crown had cost. Ravenna did not look at her again. She found Obi on the upper walkway above the main work floor 20 minutes later. Below them, the crew was already moving. The east crane was running. Brightwell had authorized the emergency repair the moment the contract terms cleared. Payroll would be stable by end of week. The Morrison extension had confirmed that morning. Obi stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the floor below the way a man looks at something he had been afraid he was going to lose. "They should hear from you," he said. "Not from a memo, from you." Ravenna looked at the crew working below, her father's kind of people, the ones who actually held the weight. "They will," she said. She looked at the building, at the name above the entrance, at the workers moving through the floor of it. Her father's voice came back the way it always did when she needed it most, unhurried and clear. "Never fall in love with the name on a building. Fall in love with how people are treated inside it." The name above the door had not changed, but the people deciding what happened inside it had. Ravenna stepped into the wide morning light that came through the warehouse windows, and for the first time in 4 years, the only weight she was carrying was her own.